The silver was still cold from the Atlantic when the baker picked up her chalk. A Spanish galleon had just groaned against the dock at Seville. Hull doors opened, silver bars stamped with the royal seal thudded onto the wooden ramp. Armed guards stood watch. Officials from the Casa de Contratación counted every bar. The king's fifth was set aside. Merchants claimed their consignments. The unloading would take all day. 3 streets inland, a woman looked out her window. She watched the dockworkers spill into the taverns, fresh silver already in their pockets. Then she walked to the slate board outside her shop, scratched out the old bread price, and wrote a higher one. The galleon was not finished unloading. The bread was already more expensive. She was not a speculator. She was not greedy. She simply understood something that escaped every minister in the palace. When new money enters a city, it enters through specific hands first. Those hands spend it at yesterday's prices. But the people who sell bread and meat and rent see those coins coming, and they adjust before the money spreads further. The dock worker paid this morning could afford the new price. The dock worker on a fixed contract who would not be paid until next month could not. He hauled silver bars all day, and his lunch just got more expensive. 1 ship, 1 chalkboard, 2 completely different Spains. The crown looked at that ship and saw victory. The baker looked at that ship and saw tomorrow's invoice. I want to follow her eyes, not the king's. Now follow that silver 1 mile inland to the treasury. Because the king did not see the baker. The king saw a war chest. The mountain that fed this flood sat 13,000 feet above sea level in the Andes, Potosí, a ridge of silver ore so rich that within decades of its discovery in 1545, it became the largest silver deposit on Earth. Indigenous laborers dug it at lethal altitudes, conscripted under the Mita system inherited from the Inca and sharpened into a colonial forced labor machine. The mercury processing poisoned them. The collapses killed them. The silver poured out anyway. Combine Potosí with the Mexican mines, and over the next century Spain extracted more silver than had circulated in Europe for the previous 1,000 years. The crown took its quinto real off the top. The rest belonged to private miners and merchants. Twice a year the treasure fleets sailed, synchronized with hurricane seasons and the rhythm of European war demands. And here is where the ledger gets strange. The silver arrived at Seville. It was counted, taxed, recorded. Then it left. Most of it never reached the Castilian interior. It never built roads, granaries, or workshops. It went straight back out the door to Genoese bankers, Flemish armorers, Dutch provisioners, and eventually Chinese silk merchants in Manila. The mountain was in Peru. The silver was Spanish for about 15 minutes. Then it belonged to everyone else. The king owned the mine. But he had a problem. Wars do not wait for treasure fleets. Charles V and his son Philip II spent decades fighting the Ottomans, the French, the Protestant German princes, and the Dutch rebels. These were not cheap hobbies. Mercenaries in Flanders demanded coin on Monday, not a promissory note redeemable whenever the next flota sighted land. So the crown did what any entity with a future revenue stream does. It borrowed against the next shipment. Genoese banking families extended short-term loans at interest rates that could hit 12–14% annually. The collateral was specific future silver deliveries. The arrangement looked rational. The crown got immediate military liquidity without squeezing Castilian taxpayers. The bankers got an asset backed by hard metal from a mountain that never seemed to run dry. But the silver was not arriving fast enough to cover both the war expenses and the compounding interest. Each new loan rolled over the old debt. Each new shipment was already spoken for before the galleon crew even sighted the Spanish coast. The king was the richest monarch in Christendom on paper. In practice, he was a man with a mountain in Peru and an overdraft in Genoa who had to ask permission to spend his own treasure. The silver had not even been mined yet, and it was already spent. The receipts had other men's names on them, so in 1557, Philip II did what any over-leveraged sovereign does. He stopped paying. The first Spanish sovereign default was not a collapse. It was a forced conversion. Short-term high-interest loans were unilaterally turned into long-term low-interest bonds. The bankers, especially the Fugger family of Augsburg who had lent heavily to Charles V, were devastated. Some went bankrupt. Others swallowed their losses and stayed in the game because Spain was still the biggest silver customer in Europe, and walking away meant losing all future business. The default looked like a masterstroke. The crown shed its most crushing short-term obligations. It bought breathing room. But the breathing room was expensive in a way the palace did not immediately grasp. Future lenders, having watched the Fuggers get burned, now priced in the default risk. Interest rates on new Spanish borrowing rose. The crown had not solved its debt problem. It had swapped one group of creditors for another and made the next round of borrowing more expensive. Philip would default again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. 4 bankruptcies in 50 years. Each one a symptom, never a cure. Each one a confession that the silver was never really Spain's money. It was a river that passed through Spanish accounts on its way to creditors, and the crown was just the toll booth operator who kept having to borrow from the drivers. Defaulting did not erase the debt. It changed the creditor and raised the interest rate. You can stiff a banker once. The second banker charges extra for the privilege. But the cost was not only higher interest at the palace level. The silver was doing something slower and stranger, something that did not require a single signature. It was killing the workshops. Toledo, 1580s. A textile workshop that once produced decent wool cloth for the domestic market is shutting down. The master weaver can sell his cloth, but not at a price that covers his costs. His skill has not declined. His raw wool has not gotten worse. The problem is that silver has pushed up the price of everything around him. Labor costs more because his workers need to eat bread that now costs 3 times what it did when he was an apprentice. Rent costs more. His own lunch costs more. Meanwhile, Flemish and English cloth floods into Spanish markets. It is cheaper, often higher quality, and it is paid for with the very same Spanish silver that the weaver's customers used to spend on local goods. The mechanism is brutally simple. Silver raises Spanish prices relative to foreign prices. Spanish exports become uncompetitive. Imports become irresistible. Domestic industry gets squeezed from both sides. Between 1550 and 1620, the number of looms in Castilian textile centers drops sharply. Workshops that employed dozens of artisans now stand empty. The weaver's children will not learn his trade. They will become servants for the silver-wealthy families in Seville, or they will leave for the colonies. Spain is rich in metal and poor in productive capacity. It has become a funnel for silver and a market for everyone else's products. The silver made everything in Spain more expensive. Dutch cloth stayed cheap. Spanish workshops could not compete with their own country's treasure. The crown called the silver a blessing. The empty loom called it something else. And the silver did not stop moving once it reached Europe. It kept going. A separate fleet route ran from Acapulco on the Pacific coast of Mexico across the ocean to Manila. The Manila galleons carried silver. They returned with silk, porcelain, and spices. The reason was a brutal price asymmetry. Silver was relatively scarce in China, where the Ming dynasty had switched its tax system to silver and created massive demand for the metal. Silver commanded far more purchasing power in Asia than it did in Europe. Spanish merchants could buy silk in China for a fraction of what it would cost in Flanders, sell it in Europe or the Americas, and pocket the margin. The crown tried to restrict the outflow. Merchants ignored the restrictions. The incentive was too strong. The silver followed the markup. The markup led to Asia. Spain watched its own money sail to a continent it could not even colonize. One sack of silver from Mexico could buy silk in China, and mercenaries in Flanders and bread nowhere in Spain. The treasure was global. The purchasing power was everyone else's. The receipt was nailed to a Castilian door. Now step into the life of an ordinary Castilian farmer in 1600. His grandfather had seen the first silver fleets arrive, and had heard the priests proclaim that God had blessed Spain with unimaginable wealth. The grandfather believed it. The grandson is holding more coins than his grandfather ever held. The coins buy less bread. The farmer does not understand monetary economics. He does not need to. He knows that a decade ago a day's wage bought a sack of grain. Now the same wage buys 2/3 of that sack. He knows that his neighbor who made wool cloth closed his workshop because Flemish cloth is cheaper. He knows that his son who went to Seville for work sends home coins that disappear faster than the old coins used to. Prices had roughly quadrupled over the 16th century. Wages had risen too, but not nearly enough. By the early 1600s, real wages in Castile had fallen by an estimated 20 to 30% from their early century peak. The farmer is worse off than his grandfather, and he lives in an empire that owns a mountain of silver. That is the gap. That is the ghost in the ledger. An empire can be awash in treasure, and its people can still grow poorer. The treasure only helps if it reaches the hands of the people who need to buy bread. The Spanish silver reached the hands of bankers, foreign merchants, and distant silk weavers. The Castilian farmer got the price tag. The galleons arrived full. The bread price rose. The baker was the only honest economist in the kingdom. One final image from Potosí, decades later. The mountain is still being mined, but the richest seams are thinning. The indigenous laborers are still dying. The silver still flows down to the coast, onto the ships, across the ocean. But the fleet is smaller now. The English and the Dutch have learned to raid the treasure routes. The crown has defaulted 4 times. The Genoese bankers have extracted their pound of silver and moved on to safer borrowers. The mountain is a monument to a strange kind of failure. It gave Spain enough metal to buy anything and enough debt to own nothing. The galleons stopped. The prices did not. The workshops never came back. The baker's chalkboard still hangs on Calle Sierpes. The price has been scratched out and rewritten higher so many times the slate is worn thin. Spain found more silver than any kingdom in history and still went broke. The receipt is still on the table.